Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Enablement Uncanned. We've got a superstar guest with us today, Kunal. How are you?
I'm very good, thanks, Jack. How are you?
Yeah, can't complain. We were just talking about, I know everyone talks about the weather, right? When they
Yeah.
first start conversations, we should really do something else. Um, but yeah, it's terrible here today, so I know that's surprising. Um, but yeah, Kunal, thanks for joining. It's great to have you on,
Thanks for having
and
me.
welcome again to the Enablement Uncanned, no fluff, vendor agnostic podcast, as we call it.
Love it.
And yeah, today we're talking about cracking the sales coaching code, what
Mm.
we've given it the name of, and sort of why it's so hard and how to fix it. But Kunal, you've been you're a founder at Sales Velocity Labs, you're VP Revenue Enablement at Core Search, founding ambassador at Sales Enablement Collective, and I think you're a member of the Sales Enablement Society as well, aren't you, Kunal? I think that's everything.
Yeah, I knew my LinkedIn headline would come in handy one day. But yeah, though you pretty much got it right there. That's basically what I do.
There you go. Yeah, he's for those of you who don't know Kunal, he's a superstar in the enablement sector and super sort of active and big on LinkedIn. So I'm sure a lot of you already know who he is. So yeah, it's a great guest to have. So yeah, let's sort of get kicked off with this because let's sort of start with an uncanned hot take from yourself, Kunal, and maybe sort of start with a bit of an intro as well. It'd be great for the listeners to kind of hear sort of what you've been up to, who you are, a bit of a background, and then I'll let you go on with that.
Sure. So yeah, a bit of an intro. So I'm Kunal. I'm based out of London, and I've been in various enablement roles, different shapes and sizes for the last I don't know, like about 16 years, I'm saying, maybe 17 years. And then that's obviously before enablement was kind of what it is today.
Yeah.
Um, Maybe even before I realized what it was, what I was actually doing. But that entire experience has taught me obviously a lot. It's allowed me to define kind of my own principles and even some IP when it comes to enablement and how I do certain things. One of the things that it's definitely allowed me to do is become a lot more data driven in terms of how I define enablement strategy and how I execute and measure it. Um, which has led me to kind of creating sales velocity labs, right? Which is essentially about helping other enablers do exactly the same thing. So yeah, that's pretty much what I do and what I've been pretty busy with as well. And in terms of the kind of the hot take, this uncanned take on sales coaching, um, we I guess the obvious place to start is, well, what's the biggest challenge, right?
Hmm.
Managers face, right, when it comes to coaching. And the way I'll spin this slightly is the uncan take is the biggest challenge managers face is the consequence of not coaching, right?
Yeah,
Let's face
right.
it. And ultimately that is getting fired, right? Ultimately,
Hmm.
at the end of the day,
Losing a job. Yeah.
losing a job, career impact due to underperformance of the manager and their team, right? That's the ultimate outcome here of not coaching, right? And a big challenge. But of course, sales managers do face lots of direct and indirect challenges when it comes to
Hmm.
to coaching. Um, but I wanted to kind of start off on the more indirect aspect here as well, right? Because it's often, I think, understated, let's say. Um, I personally talk a lot about revenue impact and data driven and all those kind of things, right? Um, And I talk about kind of the impact of sales training, coaching, enablement in general, and how it leads to revenue impact and why it's so important for us enablers to be talking about that and doing that and practicing it. So when I think about my kind of enablement methodology, let's call it, probably isn't, but let's just call it that. Um, I devised this thing called a strategic enablement blueprint, which we'll talk about a bit later on. But what this blueprint essentially tells me is how do we correlate enablement programs to revenue impact, right? There's two things there, right? But there's a bunch of stuff in the middle of that. Uh,
Hmm.
and that is basically kind of broken up into two parts. I call it kind of your lagging indicators and then your leading indicators, right? Now, the absolute cornerstone of that blueprint, and how you connect enablement to revenue impact is what's within the leading indicators, right? And specifically, it is the seller's capability, their competence, their ability to perform the tasks and execute the activities
Yeah.
they need to sell, right? End to end. It's a non-exhaustive list. Um, but what's the biggest driver of that? It's sales coaching, right?
Yeah, I love that.
So when we think about the impact and of not doing this, let's just think about that, what that means from an enablement perspective, why it's so important, not just to us, but to sellers and to managers and ultimately the business, right? So hopefully that kind of gives a bit of a maybe slightly not so obvious take on why this is so important.
Yeah, no, it's a really good summary, and it's such a hot topic, right?
It
Sales
is.
coaching is such a hot topic. Everyone talks about it, and I guess it's a lot easier to talk about than it is actually to implement correctly. That's what, we tend to see, right?
Yeah.
And the challenges are astronomical with sales
Right.
coaching, and you kind of touched on it really, really well there. How do you implement it? What does that look like? And it doesn't just affect the enablers, but it also affects the salespeople. Because if, I'm a salesperson, have been all my life,
Mm.
not all my life, but the majority of it. If I'm not coached or I don't have adequate sales coaching, which I do, but if I weren't, I wouldn't feel valued. And then if you don't feel valued,
Right.
you leave. And if you leave, or you get fired because because you're not performing, all of
Yeah.
a sudden the revenue dips, right? And so there's so many different moving parts to it, like you said.
100%. Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I think we'll dive into some of those challenges because we've got bandwidth constraints, we've got struggle to find the time,
Yeah.
um, you know, who to coach, what to coach, how to do it, and then scaling it, right? Because how do
Yeah.
we scale it? And I think you've got a few good stories to talk about. But yeah, the impact on not doing it is definitely, everyone always talks about the impact of doing something, but
Yeah.
not not the impact of not doing it, which we were
Right.
talking about just before this podcast, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, so let's dive into some of these challenges then. So
Mm.
let's talk about the time. Let's talk about the bandwidth constraints. Why is coaching often the first thing that sort of management teams deprioritize, I guess is the best way of putting
Yeah.
it. And how can
Yeah.
leaders then make it a habit rather than like an afterthought, I guess.
Yeah. Why does it get deprioritized? If I was to really just boil this down, I'd say, I mentioned things like leading indicators, lagging indicators.
Mm,
Sales coaching is deprioritized simply because it has a lagging impact.
mm,
Sure, there might be some circumstances where you see some immediate impact in something is changed, right? Somebody's behaving in a different way. That behavior has been impacted. The capability is there. But when are we really going to see the benefits of that? Right? It's maybe in a quarter, maybe 2 quarters, maybe the rest of the year, maybe never,
And we
right?
were just touching on that, weren't we?
Right.
About how, when you remove an enablement function or, like you said, the lagging indicators, you don't
Yeah,
actually see the impact of that until 6, 7, 8 months down the line,
right.
which, talks to what
By
you're
then
saying
it's by then it's too late, right?
there.
The impact is has been, is there in terms of missed numbers, quota, all of that kind of thing, and then leading to disengagement, from the sales rep, leading to thinking, well, I could be earning more money or better commission somewhere else. Um, at the same time, I don't feel I'm being supported by my management here, which is
Mm,
probably the number one reason why people leave any company, right? Um, and then, what's the biggest cost of to a company? Typically, it's the salesperson leaving because they become disengaged. And when they become disengaged,
yeah.
they're not going that extra mile. They're not doing that extra thing that is going to push them over the edge, and they start to look for work elsewhere. Um, and all of that time invested into them, right? From enablement, from the tech investments that you made for them, all those kind of things
Yeah.
starts to dwindle away. And at the same time, that revenue or the bookings revenue that they're supposed to be bringing in is dwindling away as well. And then they leave, and now we've got a vacancy with no revenue coming in.
And you got a hole,
Right.
right? It's
Massive
so true.
expense, massive expense. So, you know, and all that's a lagging impact. It's too late when we realize. So I think that's one of the key reasons why sales coaching is often deprioritized. It is a lagging impact to it. And what managers really want to focus on is what's going to have an impact right now,
Mm,
today, right? And what's the number one thing that's going to have impact today is focusing on the deals which are on the table right now to be
mm.
closed this quarter. And that's what becomes a priority. Now, fair enough. Yes, it is a priority. I'm not saying it's not a priority. It is. But there's a cost to that as well,
Mm. It's
which is
so true.
yeah,
The amount of sales calls I've been on, not here, but at previous places, that is just like, what deals have you got? What's the situation? Where's this? Where's that? And it's like, yeah, okay, I get it. And it is always the number one priority. But
yeah,
yeah, the lagging piece is super interesting. And yeah, they've got to make it a habit, right? Than an afterthought. I think
Mhm.
that's the biggest thing. If you don't put it in your day to day, I think the
Yeah,
average sales tenure is anywhere between I know Gartner were talking about it, but it's about 18 months, which
yeah,
is really low, really, really low.
right,
And that's across SaaS, right? So whether someone joins, that it's about 18 months that they'll look to leave. Um, and you
yeah,
think about the investment you put into that salesperson in those 18 months, and then you've got the knowledge gap of when they leave and hiring someone else and
right.
ramping them back up.
Doing it all again. Yeah,
You're talking
exactly.
like a 2 year, almost 2.5 year cycle
Right.
that you're then having to repeat. So no wonder there has been so many layoffs and people
Yeah.
leaving and bits and pieces.
It's time
So
to break that cycle, right? It's we do need to think differently about this, and then I think enablement's got a big part to play.
and maybe you'll change the game with the methodology that you were talking about. This is you. Your blueprint's going to change it, Canal, I think.
Oh, let's see. I mean, like I say, it is about opening eyes to
Mm,
how and why this is so important, like revenue impact and what enablement does, and kind of showing that we're not just a cost center, right? We are an investment, and what's the definition of investment? You get a return. So what is that?
exactly.
Um, and yeah, like I said, sales competence capability is a massive part of that, and coaching is the number one thing that drives it. So,
hmm So how do you then know who and what to coach? Well, I guess,
yeah,
you're talking about tech tools, you're talking about frameworks. Everyone talks about Medpick Challenger, all these sort of wonderful frameworks that are
yeah,
ultimately the same thing, just branded differently.
yeah,
My opinion. Other opinions are valid.
yeah,
How can we, who needs coaching the most? How do we sort of pinpoint those right skills and behaviors to focus on? Is there kind of a
yeah,
particular way that you do this or you look to do it?
yeah. So maybe I can talk about personal experience here, right? So
Yeah, absolutely.
I talk a lot about being data driven, right? And one of the core aspects of that is knowing what we need to do, why we're doing it, where we're doing it, and how we're going to do it, right?
hmm
I almost think of it as kind of levers that we're pulling, right? Different levers, whether they're lagging indicators, leading indicators, but it's about knowing which one to pull and how hard to pull it as well, right? So data plays a massive part in that. So obviously there's the lagging perspective, right? What's happening with our pipeline? What's happening with our win rates, our average deal values, our length for sales cycle, the core components of sales velocity, essentially. And those are very much lag, right? The
hmm
common misconception is that enablement drives those things. We don't drive those things. We impact them ultimately, right? Which is the entire chain of events, right? But we don't directly impact those things. What does impact those things is the execution against them.
Mm,
So, are we
exactly.
doing those discovery calls? Are we delivering that proposal in the way we're supposed to? Are we doing a business case for that deal, which for that certain value? Are we differentiating in this way? It's a non-exhaustive list of stuff. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, um, how do we know who to coach? Well, if we're measuring all of those things, right, lagging indicators, leading indicators, then perhaps there's a way to find out where the common gaps are, the key gaps are. Take capability and competencies, let's say, for example, core leading indicator. How do I find out what my team's strengths are, what the gaps are? Um, by speaking to them, right? Is the most
Yeah,
basic,
yeah.
the most simplistic way, right? By speaking to them and understanding how you're doing. What's a big challenge right now, right? What are the key barriers you're seeing? What's happening in this deal? Have we done X, Y, Z when it comes to that deal, right? What are
hmm
the gaps? What's the risk? How do we mitigate that risk? Do you know how to mitigate that risk? Questioning, right? Continuous questioning. Ultimately, that is what coaching is all about. So simple conversations is one way. The second way is to measure it in some kind of way. Now, I've done things in the past. around competency platforms, competency assessments, that kind of thing, right? So defining, well, what's the core set of competencies for a specific role, right? In a sales function, maybe you're SDR, an account exec, or maybe an account manager or something like that. Um, and how do our people perform against that? Now it's kind of subjective, right? Because it's a manager-led
Hmm.
thing. You're kind of asking the managers how well do they perform question, techniques on a discovery call.
Hmm. Hmm.
How, it's observational. It's like, yeah, you might get some inkling there, but it's not a perfect recipe either. Then to take it to the next level of advancement, then you're talking about things like conversation intelligence, right? Call recording, that kind of thing. And you're listening into calls and you're kind of seeing how people are doing certain things. And you're using that as a more of a, objective way to assess somebody. Did they do those things? And where do we think the gaps are? And those kind of platforms as well will have elements of scorecarding and assessment as well, right? Especially now with AI, it's becoming a lot easier to kind of, you decrypt transcripts
Yeah.
to meaningful insights. Um, and then there's also kind of the whole learning and development piece, training, what kind of scores are they getting? How well did they perform that thing, that knowledge check or that quiz or whatever it was. And then something that I've been getting into more recently is around AI role play coaching. So, defined coaching scenarios and use cases for a product, for a scenario, with discovery call, cold call, a proposal call, whatever it is,
Yep.
and how well does an individual perform against assessed scorecard against those things. So that's giving me a sense of reality as well, right? Combining all of those things. That's where the power is. We combine those things. Now I kind of starting to understand not just the core gaps and strengths of an entire team, but drill down. What are the trends and patterns we see? Is it based on cohorts? Is it based on individuals? Is it based on um, a certain region, perhaps, or even selling a certain product, right? What is it? What's driving the gaps? Um, and the impact of the gaps is like the lagging indicator, right? Well, what does
Hmm.
win rate look like for that specific segment or cohort? Is it not just like, is it 20% or 30%? Great, but that's a benchmark, right? It tells me it paints a picture, let's say, but it's the trends that tell the story, right? Is it going
Yeah.
up or is it going down? Now, suddenly, when we start thinking about trends, we're able to overlay a few things. Trend in terms of competence and capability in specific areas, and trends in terms of those lagging indicators as well. Win rate, deal values. Is there a correlation, right? That gets quite sophisticated. That's pretty much where I'm at this point.
Hence
But
the late nights and the
yeah,
weekends.
yeah, exactly. But it works and it allows you to build a credible story to really answer the question, how do you know who to coach and what to coach, right? So there's varying levels in the spectrum, right, of sophistication.
There's always going to be, and I'm going to ask you.
Yeah.
I'm going to throw you right in here and say so that
Yeah.
there was a few points there.
Yeah.
And personally, I've always, on a previous podcast, I was talking about the human element and how that kind of differs from sort of AI. And you mentioned the four things there. So talking to someone, having
Yeah.
the L&D, so actually, repeating that learning in bits and pieces. And
Yeah.
then you also mentioned conversation intelligence and AI role play, all of which are available on so many different companies these days.
Yeah.
What do you think is more important? The talking aspect and actually having a human to human conversation, or utilizing the AI? What quick fire answer?
Uh, I mean, it's going to be human, right? But that human conversation needs a trigger. It needs a
Yeah.
catalyst. It needs some context, and that's what
Hmm.
the AI can support, right? By providing that context. Um, the key point is as long as that data ultimately, if all of that translates into data, right, in some shape or form, as long as that data is let's call it, validated even psychologically by the rep, and they can, yeah, okay, it's true. I need support, or I need to get better at this thing.
Hmm.
It just enriches that conversation, right? So how can we use data to enrich that human conversation? So it is quite literally that hybrid clashing of
Making a combination of it.
that typical like AI hand and the human
Yeah,
hand.
yeah, no, I know
Yeah.
it. And
So
you're right.
yeah,
You are bang on. I think a
yeah,
lot of people are saying the same thing. And even before today, when I sent you over a brief on what we were going to talk about, and you said, "Hey, that generated via AI?" I mean, part of it was right, but it doesn't take away from the fact that we're having human to human conversation here.
Yeah.
Which reminds me of your AI LinkedIn thing that you put up, and I need to pick your brains on that to
Oh
work
yeah.
out. So
Yeah.
I still want to know how you created that or what you used for that because that was mind blowing. And for those of you who are listening that haven't seen that, make sure you do check out the AI generated podcast on one of Kunal's LinkedIn posts. Uh, it made me feel famous and ultimately wasn't real. So yeah, yeah, really helpful. So in terms of so moving on from those, so how do you've talked about AI and leveraging AI and sort of, how you keep human interaction at the center and bits and pieces like that. How do you
Mm.
scale it? Scaling the coaching and what's the best way and what kind of tips and tricks do you have around that?
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of barriers to scaling it, right? Plenty of,
Hmm.
I don't know, probably not enough time on this podcast, but um, one of the things I always say is when it comes to a sales manager, sales leader, um, at least 50% of their time should be spent on sales coaching.
Wow.
At least 50% of their time. Um, and if they're not able to do that for whatever reason, right? And there's plenty of valid reasons to not do that. We mentioned the barriers, right? Leading, lagging, all of that. That is more of an organizational challenge, right? But they do need to escalate and say, look, I'm not getting enough time to coach, right?
Hmm.
Now, hopefully that's understood by the powers that be, right? Going above,
That's a
but
separate challenge, yeah.
that's a whole new conversation, right? Yeah, exactly. So, um, but that's the point, right? How do we make sure that we're carving out that time, and escalating if we're not able to do so? Um, but how do we scale it? I mean, I personally scaled it with tech, right? Um, I
I think
tried
you
to
have to. I think
manually.
you have to. I
I
think
think we
tech,
have
it
to.
has to be part of the conversation, yeah.
I remember the first time when I started to correlate sort of competence and behaviors and capability to lagging indicators, I did it manually and it was spreadsheet hell. I tell you that. I mean, like, I'm lucky that I know how to handle a spreadsheet or two, but um, it was a nightmare. And
Hmm.
what it meant was it became a one-off.
Hmm.
I'm doing this once, never doing this again, right?
Yeah.
You cannot do it. Is sales coaching a one-time effort, right? To know who to coach and how and what to coach and how to coach them. It's not a one-time effort. It's a continual
Hmm.
process, right? It's a continual
Has to be.
activity.
Yeah.
So how do you that's the importance of scaling it, right? You need some level of tech to support this or an army of people, right? It's not going to happen. So that's how I did it, right? So I've used competency platforms, enablement platforms. I've used AI role play to determine, where the gaps are as well as actual conversation intelligence to start
Hmm.
scorecarding calls in reality and saying, well, where are the gaps? Then it becomes, a two-pronged effort, right? You're going to determine using that data and all of that information you're getting from that tech, where the biggest gaps are. Now, as an enablement, our role is probably to identify those biggest gaps, understand what the impact of not doing anything there is, and then doing something about it on scale, right? Let's face it, and having all of that data and knowing all of that information is pointless if we're not going to do something about it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So,
Yeah.
so enablement has a big part to play in defining strategies that are going to tackle the gaps. Now, what we're getting into the realms of here is actually defining targeted, laser-focused enablement strategies, right? That's how enablement becomes not just a cost center reacting to, I need to do negotiation training because of reasons, right? It's literally, we need to fix this thing. This is why. This is what it's costing us. The high performers in this area deliver this, right? This win rate, this deal value, this much
Hmm.
booking. If we can elevate every performer, average, lower and average performer to that same level, or even partially to that level, what could the impact be? Suddenly things
Hmm.
start to make sense, right, as to why we need to do something. That's a way I justify things. And essentially I'm talking about the blueprint here. But that if we can get over that challenge, we can try and scale this thing. It needs investment, right? And investment requires justification, and there's a justification.
Yeah, absolutely. No, you're right. It's interesting. We were at you and I were both at an event. It must have been a couple of years ago now about transforming.
Mm.
B and C players into A players, and how
Okay.
that's super important with
Yeah.
because it's the 80/20 principle, right? 20% of your sales staff are A players and they deliver 80% of the revenue. That's it's always the
Right.
way.
Yeah.
But it is about focusing on getting the best out of those A players to A plus players, but then also transforming those B and C,
Yeah.
um, rather than, making them feel unvalued and moving them on, actually trying to infiltrate that coaching and scale it out.
Right. And that's a really interesting point, especially around scaling this, right? Because
Yeah.
sometimes we're just not going to be able to invest both time and money into fixing this. So we're going to have to find a way, right? So
Hmm.
you mentioned the kind of A, B, C players because the A players, it's about keeping them there, right? So maybe it's a slightly different tactic and a slightly different execution as
For
to what.
sure.
How do
Yeah.
we keep them there and stop them from leaving, right? Basically, so
Yeah, you can't afford to lose them. Yeah.
retaining them, absolutely. Um, Now you're going to have some C players, maybe D players, right? They're going to be typically those people are uncoachable, right? Typically, there might be reasons why they're C and D players, but very typically. But you've got this sweet spot of B players, right? They've got potential to to be an A player, right? So they're doing something. They've cracked some level of code, but it's not quite A player level, and they've shown enough potential into from a capability perspective to be able to do it. But they're not kind of highly ranked from that perspective either. So I kind of visualize this quadrant, right, of
Hmm.
in terms of capability and actual performance, right? So bookings, let's call it, right, or quota attainment. How do we get people to the top right of that quadrant? The people in the middle, right bang in the middle, is a sweet spot. Coachable, they've shown some evidence that they can do this thing, and there's plenty of room for improvement. And if we move them towards the right, they should go to the top, right, as well. Um, maybe that's all we focus on because that's all we can focus on because we don't have the ability to scale this
You
thing.
don't have the a lot all the time either, right? And
Yeah.
as we were just mentioning,
Yeah.
coachable is a really define coachable, because this kind of leads us nice into the sort of next challenge that I wanted to talk about is sort of overcoming the resistance to coaching, and this is
Mm,
goes alongside define coachable. What is a coachable individual? Because a lot of it comes down to, sales culture, the culture of the organization.
mm,
Is coaching embedded in the bloodline of that organization? If it's not, is it an older salesperson that maybe has, grown up with the yellow pages and they and they've got their own way of doing things? Are they uncoachable? Um, why do some managers and salespeople resist coaching? How do we shift those mindsets? So there's a lot of questions there, but maybe we'll touch on that.
yeah. Yeah. You know, I think we've mentioned quite a lot of reasons, right? Bandwidth, all of that kind of thing. But also knowing how to coach is a
Mm,
key challenge. And sometimes the application of enablement efforts is not on enabling the sales force, it's enabling the managers first, because that's how you're going to amplify it, right?
top down.
Top down, yeah,
Yeah.
reinforcement, setting the scene, defining what it is, what good looks like, all of that. Um, and So there needs to be a level of investment into the managers, I think. Big barriers, not knowing how to coach. And there's plenty of kind of structures and methods of coaching, right? There's the grow model and there's various others. Um, but it's about defining what's easiest and what's the easiest to scale based on the managers that you have and their capability. Um, so that is probably the biggest one, right? After bandwidth, is just knowing how and what to coach. Then there's the kind of, well, who do I coach? Like, how do I
Hmm.
talk to this person about versus that the other person? And we kind of touched on that as well, which is that maybe that where the data comes in, right? From all other sources and angles to help guide. This is the area. Again, a big part that enablement has to play there as well. Um, Key point here, I think, in all of this is there's an underlying thread, which is enablement has to be involved,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
driving this thing, right? Understanding it, the data, the outcomes, measuring all of that kind of thing, right? We can't just say to salespeople, you got to coach, you have to coach, you have to coach. It's 50% of your time you have to coach. Not going to happen in its own. You have to be involved.
Yeah, it's picking out one of those important things you said there about coaching the coach, right? Or
Yeah.
that's what I call it, and it's one of the biggest use cases I'm seeing selling enablement software.
Yeah.
is people are saying, well, how do I coach the coach? And that's a good thing to have a mindset around, because like you said, the top down piece is the most important. If your management aren't doing it,
Mm.
why should the salesperson or the frontline sales staff do it themselves? You need to show what good looks like.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing things like the AI role play you were talking about using that,
Mm.
and what I'm seeing is one of the biggest use cases is how do we coach the coach? Let's make sure we focus on those guys first, and then it can drip down
Right.
into the actual sales staff themselves.
Yeah.
And that's how the shift of mindset, I guess,
Yeah.
happens. Um,
Definitely.
the culture change, yeah.
Culture is one of the hardest things to change, right? In any
Mm.
company. The effort and the shift and the top-down nature of it. Um, but yeah, no, you're absolutely right. This is, and we have to remember there is such thing as bad coaching as well,
Yeah.
right? There's good coaching, but there's also ineffective coaching, and there's lots of aspects to that, which again, sales leaders might be concerned about. Like, "Boy, am I actually coaching this person in the right way? Am I coaching them in the right thing? Um, are we doing it frequently enough? There's so many questions out there, but again, that's something that enablement can help with.
And your blueprint's going to solve this, I hope.
Well, it will hopefully point people in the right direction. Let's put it that way.
Yeah,
But
good.
once in that direction, there's still a level of execution to be done, right? Which there are plenty of other courses and things out there to show how to do.
Yeah, we were saying that, right? I mean, you
Yeah.
see, I mean, you could type in sales coaching into Google or Chat GPT if you wanted to, and the amount of information you could possibly get is a joke.
Yeah.
LinkedIn, everyone's talking about it.
Yeah.
And we said that right at the start of the podcast. Everyone's talking about it, but nobody really knows how to actually deliver it or do what they say they're talking about.
Right.
Um, give us some real world examples. You've been in enablement for, like you said, 16 years. I mean, that's a long old time, so you know what you're talking about. Give us some sort of real world stories where you've worked with managers, or maybe you've had some difficulty with managers to sort of improve sort of coaching practices, and then maybe some examples that of places you've worked or others that you've seen where they've actually successfully embedded into their sales culture and how that's changed it. Be good to hear some real life examples.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the biggest challenge I've seen, as we talked about, has been bandwidth and priority, right, to coaching.
Hmm.
So it's not just about enablement and my own sort of in my role talking about why it's important. It's yeah, it's been an education almost for how do you educate the management team on why we're doing this and what's so important about it. The number one way I've kind of got around that hurdle is by showing the impact.
Mm.
And the way I do that typically is by talking about a high performer as the benchmark and dissecting their level of performance, right? Why are they a high performer? What are the key things that they actually do? So yeah, let's listen into those conversations. Let's look at what they do from a maybe even an administrative perspective. Let's look at the results they're seeing from coaching and their attention to development, right? And they're taking accountability for that. Essentially, that spectrum of competencies, what does it look like for a top performer? And then saying, well, there's a benchmark there. There's a threshold, right? And using that
Hmm.
information to prove and justify, well, if they're doing all of these things and that's why the level of performance is what it is, and what if, imagine if we did that for 80% of the others, right? What could have impact will that have? So we're having to educate in that way. And that's what I've done. The tech has certainly helped, right? But I think, the most satisfying story I can probably tell when it comes to coaching is coaching I've done myself,
Hmm.
right? Uh, maybe not relying on a manager to do it, but let me do it. I'll do it. Fine. So
Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that. Don't worry about
yeah, so it was a sales rep, and yeah, their win rate was kind of lowish, and the deal values weren't quite there, and they were just trying to hit quotes, all of the usual things, right? Um, and we sat down and we focused on just one deal, right? Not from a deal review perspective, but a coaching perspective. Let's use that as an
it.
example. Um, and essentially, what it came down to, they weren't doing enough. There's a few things, but they weren't doing enough research into the account, into the company, to be able to carve out some meaningful pain points and challenges, right? And if they weren't doing that as a first step, then they weren't having the right conversation with their champions, right?
Yeah, completely different. Yeah.
And um, so I literally spent maybe half an hour, 30 minutes, face to face this was as well, which helped, um, to talk about how to just research that company to, and we were using Medpic at the time, right? So to determine some of the high level aspects, even hypotheses of some components of Medpic, specifically what's the challenge?
Hmm.
How could we quantify the impact of that challenge to turn it into some metrics that we can use? Um, do we have a champion out there, right, that we can use to validate some of this stuff and talk to? Just simple, just going through it. At the end of that conversation, the one thing that really resonated, I still remember, which is why I'm talking about it, is they said, if I had known this stuff a year ago, I would have at least closed 3 or 4 deals at an average of
Amazing.
100K, right? That's one person, 30 minutes.
There's
One
your
person,
impact. There's your
30 minutes.
impact right there.
Right.
You know, 3 or 4 deals, and you take an average deal value, and you say half an hour of
Yeah,
coaching is now
yeah.
there's your revenue impact. Yeah,
100%. And ultimately, they did deliver on that impact, right? So yes,
amazing.
one thing to saying it, but did they actually turn it around? Yes. Was this the sole thing? Maybe not. There's probably lots of things, but it certainly was a trigger and a catalyst to figure out how to do this. But also, from a rep's perspective, it's a cultural thing to want to get that coaching, to
Yeah,
ask for it, to say, I need coaching here. Who can give it to me? I need some help. I need support. It's a cultural thing, right? People don't ask, used to like to ask for help.
yeah.
It's a tough thing to do. Um, so yeah, that's one story. And did that need much data? Did it need much? No. Like, so,
Yeah, but it's the
it's
talking point.
a
It's
talking
having a
point.
conversation with someone, like you were saying a little bit earlier.
Yeah,
Sitting
yeah,
down with someone and saying, right, let's go through this. And
right,
sometimes that is all it's going to take, particularly if they're a B plus player or an A player, and they just need that
right,
little bit of
yeah,
tweaking it in one scenario. And that's all it is. It's these small 1-2% gaps that can really help make the difference.
yeah, 100%.
And you must have been super proud of that, because it's such a pleasing thing when that happens, right? To know that conversation you've had has had that impact. So
It's why we do enablement, right? It's to
yeah,
to
yeah.
transform people's ability to do something, right, and make a difference in their lives. I think that's so satisfying. We shouldn't forget that. So past all the data and all of the blueprint and all of that, we're making a difference to people's lives.
You've made it sound really simple. We've talked about all these challenges and kind of things, and it is. People talk about all the challenges that you get, but ultimately there are a few small things that are relatively simple that you can then go and implement,
Oh yeah,
and it will make a big difference.
yeah,
Um, so let's finish with that. Let's talk about what you're doing with Velocity Labs, because I appreciate you sort of I know I filled out some bits and pieces for you the other day, and
yeah.
you've got a course coming out at the end of the month, right? So maybe give us, not that I want to throw this into a sales pitch for you, Canal, but please do tell the listeners a little bit about
Yeah.
this data-driven strategic definition of enablement, the storytelling aspect of the course, the enablement blueprint that you're sort of rolling out.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for the opportunity. And yeah, so at the end of the month, we're launching a course. It's called a Strategic Enablement Blueprint. Um, Basically, it's a accumulation of my experience through the last decade or two on what good enablement actually is, and more specifically, how to deliver a revenue impacting enablement function that
Hmm.
is strategic, that is laser focused, that is data driven. Um, why am I doing this? What's the number one challenge facing enablers today? It's proving their value, proving impact, right? Number one challenge. And the consequence of that is, it's so big, as we've seen over the last 2, 3 years, right? Not just to enablers, but to even enablement vendors, in the tech space, for example. Um, Something needs to change.
Yeah,
Something has to change. We cannot be seen as a cost center anymore. We know we're not, but we have to show it to the people who hold the purse strings, right? That's not always the sales leadership. That's sometimes the founders, the CFOs.
yeah.
We need to make sure that we're delivering that and showing credibly that we're doing that. So, what I realized over the last few years, I've been talking about this whole topic is you can't wrap it up into a webinar or a blog post or a LinkedIn article or podcast. You just can't. It just doesn't work.
No.
so many practical aspects to it, from obtaining data to simulating it to modeling it to understanding it, and then to using it to build and define a strategy, and then ultimately to measure it, and then importantly to to tell a story around it in a way that's credible to executives, right? Gone are the days when we can say, oh, we certified 50 people and our LMS, took in 100 people and they did a course in 4 weeks. Like no one cares.
Yes,
Right?
so true.
So
Yeah, so what?
so what?
Thanks. So what?
So this course is about the practical steps, actual takeaways that will allow all enablement individuals to pick it up and actually implement it in their business. The impact of that being suddenly being more strategic, elevating the profile of enablement within their company, elevating their careers, right?
Hmm.
One key metric I've seen, talk about this previously, is there are more chief revenue officer vacant positions in the market today than there are VP of enablement.
Wow.
Um, do a
Isn't
search,
that
you see,
interesting?
right? There's
Yeah.
a reason for that because enablement isn't valued enough to hold that title, right? And on a mass scale. Um, so what this course is about is how to help individuals get there. It's going to help us all.
So interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because ultimately it is, we were talking about it offline, right? How many different roles, because in Europe, enablement is such
Yeah.
a word that isn't necessarily used widely across some of the European countries. And where does that fit in? Is it a CRO role? Is it a training role? Is it this, that, and the other? That's really, really interesting. And yeah, ultimately it's going to help. And please, everyone listening or watching should really sort of check out Kunal's blueprint, his website. And I'm going to again go out on a whim and say that my marketing team are going to put some flashy images up. They did it last time, so hopefully they'll do it again. Um, and his website is salesvelocitylabs.com. Check out Kunal Pandya on LinkedIn, and yeah, check out his enablement blueprint and get stuck into some of that. But yeah, thank you so much for today. It's been really, really insightful, and I think we've sort of touched on quite a lot of different things. So it's been
Absolutely.
great.
Yeah. It's been a good session when we could probably talk for a lot longer. So,
So I've already been thinking about maybe we should get you back on. We should talk about this, we talk about that, because there are so many elements to this. Getting a seat at the table being one of them.
yeah,
How do we not manipulate, but how do we get that seat at the
yeah.
table with the top dogs? But yeah, thanks again, Kunal. You've been an absolute
You got it.
superstar, and this has been Enablement Uncanned. Thanks, everybody.